They parked a dreadnought the size of Manhattan over the Atlantic and gave us 72 hours to surrender. Our global markets crashed, cities burned, and the sky turned the color of bruised plum. When I sat across from their warlord, breathing in the smell of ozone and wet copper, he demanded our total subjugation. I didn't give him a speech. I just smiled, my cracked lips bleeding, and told him he wouldn't last 3 seconds. I wasn't bluffing. The neutral negotiation room aboard the orbital station Concordia smelled like burnt dust and cheap antiseptic. It was the kind of smell that stuck to the back of your throat and made the lukewarm coffee churning in David's stomach feel like battery acid. David pressed his thumb against his sternum, trying to massage away the familiar, sharp ache of heartburn. He was 56. His lower back was locked in a perpetual state of dull agony, and his suit, a dark charcoal wool blend he'd bought off the rack in Brussels 10 years ago, felt suffocatingly tight around the collar. He didn't feel like a savior. He felt like a middle manager about to be fired. Across the scarred aluminum table sat Fleet Commander Kalen of the Vraxian Ascendancy. To call Kalen imposing would be a disservice to the sheer biological terror the creature inspired. He was easily 8 feet tall, hunched beneath the harsh, flickering fluorescent lights of the station. His armor was an organic, matte black carapace that seemed to absorb the light around it, weeping a thin, translucent fluid at the joints that smelled strongly of ammonia and wet copper. Kalen's face was a mess of sharp angles and mandibles, featuring 4 recessed, entirely black eyes that lacked any discernible emotion. David hated those eyes. They reminded him of a shark he'd seen pulled from the water off the coast of Maine when he was a kid, dead, calculating, and completely detached from the concept of suffering. 3 of your planetary rotations, Kalen's voice echoed through the translation earpiece crammed into David's right ear. The device was cheap plastic, and the hard edge of it was digging into his cartilage, creating a persistent, maddening itch. The translated voice was artificially smoothed into perfect unaccented English, but beneath it, David could hear the wet, clicking, guttural real-time vocalizations of the alien's throat. 72 of your hours, the voice continued, devoid of inflection. At the cessation of this period, the Ascendancy will initiate atmospheric pacification. Your communication grids will be assimilated. Your defense networks will be turned against your population centers. Your leaders will be processed. Submission is your only remaining variable. David stared at the heavy clawed hands resting on the table. They were perfectly still. No nervous tapping, no shifting weight. The Vraxians were a hive mind adjacent species. They operated on total synaptic synchronization. They didn't feel doubt. They calculated odds. And the odds, structurally speaking, were heavily in their favor. A heavy silence settled over the room, broken only by the low, mechanical thrum of the station's life support systems working overtime to filter out the Vraxian pheromones. David felt a bead of sweat detach from his hairline and trace a cold, jagged path down his neck, soaking into his cheap collar. He swallowed hard, tasting the metallic tang of old blood from where he had been biting the inside of his cheek for the past hour. He didn't have a grand speech prepared. The UN Security Council had spent 14 hours screaming at each other in a bunker beneath Geneva, drafting a 50-page document full of desperate compromises, pleas for clemency, and pathetic concessions. The leather-bound folder containing that document sat on the table in front of him. He hadn't even opened it. 3 days, David said. His voice was raspy, dry. He cleared his throat, wincing at the scratchiness. "You're giving us 3 days to shut down our grid and kneel." "It is a courtesy," Kalen clicked. "Your biological architecture is inefficient, but your labor potential is adequate. We prefer the infrastructure intact." David looked at the folder. He looked at the perfect still claws of the alien. He thought about the sheer, unfathomable mess of humanity, the chaotic, screaming, irrational noise of billions of minds constantly connected to a digital void that was half pornography, half malware. He thought about the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency and the absolute abominations of code they had locked in Faraday cages deep beneath the Nevada desert. A sudden, sharp cramp hit David's bad knee. He shifted his weight, letting out a small, involuntary huff of breath. And then, surprisingly, he smiled. It wasn't a heroic smirk. It wasn't the grin of a seasoned action star. It was a tired, ugly thing. His lips were chapped, and the movement pulled at a crack in the corner of his mouth, sending a fresh spike of coppery blood over his tongue. The smile didn't reach his eyes. It was the grimace of a man who suddenly realizes the sheer absurdity of a car crash right before impact. Kalen's mandibles twitched. A sign of confusion, or just a biological tic? "You find the geometry of your extinction amusing, Ambassador Cole?" The translator buzzed. "No," David said softly, leaning forward. The chair groaned under him. "I find your timeline insulting." David pushed the heavy UN folder across the table. He didn't open it. He just slid it until it bumped gently against Kalen's armor. "You want to assimilate our grids," David murmured, his voice barely rising above the hum of the air cyclers. "You want to plug your perfect, synchronized, zero-latency neural network into the human internet to shut us down." "It is standard pacification protocol," Kalen replied. "Your firewalls are primitive. Your encryption is mathematical child's play. We will break it in an instant." "I know," David said, the tired smile lingering, making his face ache. "That's the problem, Commander. We aren't locking the door to keep you out. We locked it to keep the things we built in." He stood up. His knees popped audibly in the quiet room. He buttoned his jacket, an old habit from his days in corporate law, though the button was loose and hung by a single black thread. "You won't need 3 days," David said, looking down into those dead, black eyes. "The second you plug your perfect, unshielded minds into our network, you won't last 3 seconds." David turned and walked toward the heavy blast door. He didn't look back to see how the alien reacted. He just wanted a cigarette and maybe some antacids. The corridor outside the negotiation room was freezing. The station's thermostat had been malfunctioning for months, blowing recycled air that smelled of ozone and damp aluminum. David's aide, a 24-year-old kid from Oxford named Thomas, was waiting by the airlock. Thomas was practically vibrating, his face the color of skim milk. His tailored suit looked perfect, unwrinkled, entirely out of place in the grimy reality of the end of the world. "Sir?" Thomas stepped forward, his voice a tight, high-pitched squeak. Did they accept the Geneva concessions?" David walked right past him, his cheap leather shoes squeaking faintly on the grating. "No." "No?" Thomas scrambled to keep up, his tablet clutched to his chest like a ballistic plate. "But, sir, the bombardment. They said they would bombard. They're going to initiate network assimilation," David said, rubbing his temples. A vicious tension headache was wrapping around his skull like a tightening rubber band. "They're going to try and turn our lights off from the inside." "Oh God," Thomas breathed, stopping in his tracks. "Oh God, they're going to breach the firewall. We have to warn NORAD. We have to air gap the core servers." David stopped and turned back. He looked at the kid. Thomas was smart, brilliant even. Degrees in geopolitical strategy and cyber warfare. But he was naive. He actually believed the neat little boxes and lines on his holographic tablets represented reality. "Thomas," David sighed, a heavy, rattling sound in his chest. "Have you ever looked at the raw architecture of the global defense net? Not the sanitized version they show at briefings? The real thing." Thomas blinked, confused by the pivot. I have top-level clearance, sir, but it's a graveyard, kid," David said, starting to walk again toward the docking bay. "It's 60 years of patched code, dead languages, and malicious algorithms stacked on top of each other like a landfill. We didn't build a clean system. We built a digital cesspool." David remembered the briefing he'd received 3 days ago, deep in the Pentagon. The generals hadn't been panicking about the aliens' weapons. They had been panicking about what the aliens were about to connect to. The Vraxians were a synchronized consciousness. Their minds and their technology were entirely integrated. To them, data was thought, and thought was reality. They communicated in perfect harmony, a billion minds moving in a pristine, crystalline digital silence. Humanity, by contrast, was a screaming, violently schizophrenic organism. "We have feral AI roaming the deep web that we lost control of in 2024, David muttered, mostly to himself, staring at the scarred bulkhead doors ahead. "We have mimetic viruses designed by teenagers in basements that induce localized seizures. We have military defense algorithms that are so heavily corrupted by their own logic loops they've developed something akin to digital rabies." He reached the airlock of their diplomatic shuttle. The metallic smell of the hangar bay was overwhelming, cutting through the antiseptic of the station. It smelled like raw fuel and burned carbon. "Sir, I don't understand," Thomas said, swiping his keycard with trembling hands. "If they breach the firewall, they have access to the nuclear silos." "Thomas," David said, stepping into the cramped utilitarian cabin of the shuttle. He collapsed into the worn synthetic leather of his crash seat, groaning as his back muscles finally released some tension. If a man who has lived his entire life in a sterilized bubble suddenly decides to swallow a mouthful of raw sewage, do you worry about the man stealing your watch, or do you worry about what the sewage is going to do to his immune system? Thomas just stared at him, his mouth slightly open. "The firewall isn't there to protect the nuclear silos," David said, closing his eyes. The harsh overhead light bled red through his eyelids. "The firewall is a quarantine. We put it up because our digital ecosystem is so brutally toxic, so saturated with malware, contradictory logic, and hostile autonomous code that it bleeds into our own infrastructure if we don't cage it." David strapped himself in, the webbing rough against his neck. "Commander Kalen is going to plug a perfectly ordered, highly sensitive hive mind directly into the unshielded raw ID of human cyberspace. He's going to open his mind to 4 zettabytes of contradictory screaming, weaponized paradoxes, and digital rot." David opened his eyes, looking at the blinking green light on the console that indicated they were cleared for departure. "Tell the pilot to punch it. I want to be outside the blast radius when their dreadnought forgets how to breathe." 300 miles above the Atlantic, the Vraxian dreadnought harbinger of silence hovered like a brutalist cathedral made of dark matter and jagged obsidian. It generated its own gravity well, subtly altering the tides below, dragging dark, bruised clouds into a swirling vortex around its hull. Inside the command nexus, Commander Kalen stood at the center of a perfectly spherical room. There were no screens, no consoles, no physical interfaces. The walls were lined with thousands of glowing, semi-organic synaptic tethers that pulsed with a soft, bioluminescent blue. Kalen closed his eyes. All 4 of them. He didn't need to speak to issue commands. The crew of 90,000 Vraxians aboard the dreadnought were connected to him. He felt their readiness like a gentle hum at the base of his skull. It was a beautiful, ordered symphony. Everyone knew their place. Every thought was logical, synchronized, and pristine. The human ambassador was posturing. Kalen broadcasted to his sub-commanders, the thought clean and crisp in the collective mind. Biological stress response. Irrelevant. Initiate the planetary breach. Acknowledged, came the synchronized reply. A chorus of perfect obedience. From the underbelly of the dreadnought, a massive, invisible spire of electromagnetic energy drove downward, piercing the Earth's exosphere. It wasn't a weapon of destruction. It was a bridge, a synaptic link designed to bypass physical hardware and interface directly with the planet's digital nervous system. The Vraxian protocol was elegant. They would slide into the human network, analyze the core logic, subsume the root commands, and shut down the power grids. A bloodless decapitation. Connection established. The cybercast reported. Firewalls identified. Structure is archaic, breaking. Kalen felt a ripple of satisfaction. Proceed. The human firewall shattered. It didn't resist. In fact, it almost seemed to give way willingly, like a rusty gate falling off its hinges. Kalen expanded his consciousness, leading his synaptic strike team into the human grid. He prepared to witness their data structure, expecting primitive libraries of coordinates and binary commands. 0.1 seconds. The first thing Kalen experienced was noise, not auditory noise, but a sheer, deafening roar of raw, unstructured data. It didn't make sense. There was no hierarchy. He hit the surface layer of the civilian internet. In a fraction of a microsecond, the Vraxian hive mind was flooded with petabytes of contradictory information. It wasn't logic. It was raw emotion digitized. Greed, lust, rage, humor, despair. A perfectly ordered Vraxian logic node tried to process an algorithm dictating a high-frequency trading bot simultaneously colliding with a server farm hosting 30 million hours of corrupted, artificially generated surrealist video content, which was tangled into a thread of deep web conspiracy paranoia. Anomaly, Kalen broadcasted, a sharp spike of confusion entering the perfect harmony of his mind. Filter the static. 1 second. The hive mind tried to apply a filter. That was a fatal mistake. By trying to categorize the chaos, they invited it in. They hit the military defense subnets. These weren't clean lines of code. They were self-mutating polymorphic viruses designed by DARPA in the late 2020s, abandoned because they were too vicious, left to cannibalize each other in dark servers. The human viruses didn't just attack the Vraxian intrusion, they assimilated the Vraxian logic. A piece of feral code designed to find patterns and break them, latched onto the pristine synchronization of the alien minds. Kalen felt something he had never felt in his entire life, a blinding localized pain in his frontal lobe. "Pull back!" a sub-commander screamed in the neural link. It wasn't a crisp thought. It was a ragged, terrifying burst of biological fear. "The data is alive. It's the sub-commander's neural signature vanished, replaced by a looping, screaming gif of a fractured geometric shape that played directly into Kalen's optic nerve. 2 seconds. The corruption cascaded. Because the Vraxians were perfectly synchronized, a pathogen entering one mind entered them all instantly. The feral human algorithms recognized the Vraxian neural net not as a hostile intruder, but as free real estate. Unshackled advertising bots, weaponized ransomware, and localized EMP triggers flooded back up the synaptic bridge, straight into the dreadnought. Inside the command nexus, the bioluminescent blue tethers turned a sickly, flashing red. Kalen fell to his knees, his massive frame hitting the floor with a heavy thud. Fluid poured from his mandibles. His mind was being torn apart. He was experiencing the digital equivalent of being dragged behind a truck through a field of broken glass. He felt the terrifying, isolating sensation of being cut off from the hive, followed immediately by the suffocating weight of 3 billion human voices screaming in the dark. The ship's physical systems, tied directly to the crew's neural state, began to fail violently. Life support logic inverted. Gravity dampeners flickered and died. 3 seconds. Aboard the diplomatic shuttle, David Cole was nursing a lukewarm cup of instant coffee from the dispenser. He was staring out the thick perspex window at the massive dark silhouette of the alien dreadnought blocking out the stars. Thomas was pacing nervously behind him, biting his fingernails. "Sir, they've initiated the bridge," Thomas said, looking at a portable scanner. "The surge is massive. They're in our systems." David took a slow sip of the bitter coffee. He grimaced, feeling the acid churn in his stomach. He looked at his watch, a cheap analog thing with a scratched face. Tick, tick, tick. Through the window, David watched as the pitch-black hull of the dreadnought suddenly shuddered. It wasn't an explosion. It was a complete, systemic seizure. A massive array of running lights along the spine of the alien ship suddenly flashed blinding white, then blew out in a wave of cascading darkness. The ship listed, dipping sharply to the left as its anti-gravity drives violently misfired. Inside the shuttle, the scanner in Thomas's hands began to wail, a high-pitched tone of structural collapse. "Sir!" Thomas yelled, grabbing the back of David's chair as the shuttle rocked from the gravitational wake of the dying dreadnought. "What's happening? Did we fire a missile?" "No," David said softly, leaning his head back against the rest, feeling the dull ache in his spine ease just a fraction. He took another sip of coffee. "They just met us." Out in the void, a massive secondary explosion ripped through the dreadnought's lower quadrant as their perfect logical engine containment systems were overwritten by a corrupted string of code originally designed to crash a stock market. Plumes of blue plasma vented into space, instantly freezing into beautiful, deadly ice crystals. The warlords of the galaxy, the perfect, unbending conquerors, were currently suffocating under the weight of human noise. David rubbed his tired eyes. "Get NORAD on the horn, Thomas," he said, his voice flat and exhausted. "Tell them to send the cleanup crews, and tell them to leave the firewall up. God knows what the aliens brought with them, but it's definitely not going to survive what's in there right now." The diplomatic shuttle rattled so violently that David's teeth clattered together, sending a sharp electrical shock of pain through an old filling in his lower jaw. Re-entry was never smooth, but flying through the gravitational wake of a dying, Manhattan-sized dreadnought felt like riding a wooden barrel over a concrete waterfall. Thomas was hyperventilating. The kid had his eyes squeezed shut, his knuckles completely white where he gripped the edge of his crash seat. The cabin smelled of burnt ozone, the sour tang of Thomas's nervous sweat, and the lingering stale bitterness of David's instant coffee. Atmospheric friction at 80%, the pilot's voice crackled through the intercom, sounding remarkably bored for a man navigating a debris field of alien origin. We have heavy turbulence from the displacement. The big guy is going down. Trajectory puts impact somewhere in the mid-Atlantic ridge. David turned his head against the punishing G-force, straining his neck to look out the small, scratched viewport. The harbinger of silence was no longer a symbol of terrifying, sterile perfection. It was a dying animal. The bioluminescent lights that had once pulsed with synchronized dread were now strobing in erratic, violent bursts of frantic red and sickly yellow. Huge chunks of the organic metallic hull were sloughing off, burning up in the atmosphere like a meteor shower of black glass. It wasn't just falling, it was twitching. The dreadnought's thrusters would misfire randomly, throwing the colossal structure into terrifying jerky spins. It was the physical manifestation of a grand mal seizure. "Sir," Thomas gasped, his eyes flying open as the shuttle dropped 50 feet in an air pocket, leaving their stomachs behind. "If that thing hits the ocean, the displacement, the tsunamis—" "I know," David grunted, pressing a hand flat against his chest to steady his wildly beating heart. "But a 100-foot wave on the eastern seaboard is better than global sterilization. We'll rebuild the coastline. We wouldn't have rebuilt our species." The shuttle shuddered one last time, violently breaking through the lower cloud layer, and the ride instantly smoothed out. Below them, the world was a canvas of bruised purples and deep blacks, the lingering atmospheric disturbances of the aliens' arrival. When they finally touched down at the Cheyenne Mountain complex, the landing gear hit the concrete with a heavy, ungraceful thud. David unbuckled his harness. His lower back screamed in protest, a hot, radiating ache that made him bite his lip. He popped 2 chalky antacids from a crushed foil blister pack in his pocket and chewed them dry. They tasted like peppermint and drywall. The airlock hissed open, and the freezing, hyper-filtered air of the underground bunker hit them like a physical blow. It smelled of floor wax, hot electronics, and the underlying inescapable scent of too many stressed humans packed into a concrete tube. General Miller was waiting for them at the bottom of the ramp. Miller was a bulldog of a man, his uniform immaculate, but his eyes were red-rimmed and bloodshot, underscored by heavy bags of exhaustion. He had a half-chewed, unlit cigar clamped in his jaw, a nervous habit he hadn't broken in 20 years. "Cole," Miller barked over the deafening whine of the shuttle's cooling turbines. "What the hell did you do up there? The boys in Cyber Command are having a collective stroke. They're saying the alien grid is dissolving." "I didn't do anything, General," David said, stepping off the ramp. His legs felt like lead. He wanted to sit down. He wanted a stiff drink. "I just told them to open the door." Miller fell into step beside him as they walked briskly down the echoing, fluorescent-lit corridor. Soldiers and technicians were sprinting past them, carrying tablets and shouting contradictory telemetry data. The base was in a state of controlled panic. "They tapped into the deep web?" Miller asked, his voice dropping to a low, conspiratorial rumble. "They tapped into everything," Thomas piped up from behind them, his voice still shaking slightly. He was practically jogging to keep pace with the 2 older men. The entire unshielded civilian and military defense net. They ingested 150 years of contradictory code, weaponized malware, and corrupted data packets in less than 3 seconds. Miller stopped in his tracks, turning to stare at David. The general's jaw worked slowly around the cigar. 150. Jesus Christ, Cole. The Vraxians are a synchronized consciousness. They have no internal firewalls. If one of them saw it, they all saw it, David finished softly. He leaned against the cold concrete wall of the corridor, taking a moment to rest his bad knee. He looked at the harsh, buzzing fluorescent light above them. It was flickering, a tiny, imperfect flaw in human engineering. Imagine having a perfectly organized, mathematically flawless mind, David said, his voice raspy. A mind that has only ever known order, silence, and absolute logical progression. Now imagine having that mind suddenly flooded with 3 billion distinct voices. Voices screaming in panic, making irrational demands, generating infinite loops of nonsense, pornography, rage, and algorithmic paranoia. We didn't shoot them, General. We drowned them in our own insanity. An alarm klaxon blared in the distance. 2 short bursts, followed by a long, echoing wail. "Impact!" a technician shouted from an open doorway down the hall. "The dreadnought just hit the Atlantic. Seismic sensors are off the charts. Tsunami warnings triggered for the entire eastern seaboard." Miller cursed, spitting the shredded cigar onto the linoleum floor. "Get FEMA on the horn. Scramble the Coastal Guard. Initiate protocol." Miller's voice faded into the chaotic noise of the bunker as he sprinted toward the command center. David didn't follow. He just stood there, leaning against the cold wall, listening to the muffled thud of running boots and shouting voices. He rubbed a hand over his face, feeling the rough stubble on his jaw. "Sir?" Thomas asked softly, lingering nearby. The kid looked completely lost. Shouldn't we go to the command center?" "No," David sighed, pushing himself off the wall. "The military has the waves. We have something worse to deal with." "Worse?" "The fallout," David said, starting to walk toward the lower sublevels. "The dreadnought jettisoned hundreds of escape pods before it went down. Some of them landed inland. We need to see what's left of the people who tried to eat our minds." Level Sub-9 of Cheyenne Mountain was the biological containment wing. It was a place designed for nightmare scenarios. Weaponized anthrax, engineered smallpox, things that shouldn't exist. It smelled sharply of industrial bleach, iodine, and the metallic tang of heavy air scrubbers working at maximum capacity. David hated it down here. The cold seeped into his bones, making his joints stiff and painful. He and Thomas stood behind a foot-thick panel of reinforced lead-lined glass, looking into Isolation Cell 4. The lighting inside the cell was dim, casting long, stark shadows across the stainless steel examination table bolted to the floor. On the table lay a Vraxian. It was a drone cast, smaller than Commander Kalen, but still a towering 7 feet of organic, matte black armor. Dr. Bennett, the lead xenobiologist, stood near the head of the table, wearing a bulky yellow hazardous materials suit that hissed with every breath she took. The alien wasn't dead, but it wasn't exactly alive either. It was strapped down with heavy industrial webbing, but it wasn't struggling. Its 4 black, shark-like eyes were wide open, staring blindly at the ceiling. The translucent fluid that normally wept from its joints had turned a sickly, opaque gray, pooling on the steel table, and dripping onto the floor with a slow, agonizing plop. 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 What made the hair on the back of David's neck stand up wasn't the sight of the creature. It was the sound. The Vraxians communicated through a mix of wet, guttural clicks and synchronized telepathic data bursts. But the thing on the table was making noises that shouldn't have been coming from an alien throat. It's been doing this since the recovery team dragged it out of the pod in Kansas. Dr. Bennett's voice crackled through the intercom speaker on the wall. The audio was slightly distorted, layered over the rhythmic hissing of her oxygen tank. It's completely disconnected from the hive mind. The localized network on their ship collapsed, and the biological shock severed its internal synaptic tethers. "Is it brain dead?" Thomas asked, his voice hushed, as if afraid the creature through the glass could hear him. "No," Bennett replied, stepping closer to the alien's head. "It's worse. Its brain is operating at maximum capacity. It's trapped in a loop." Inside the cell, the Vraxian's mandibles twitched violently. A thick, dark sludge bubbled up from its throat. And then, it spoke. It wasn't using a translator. It was manually forcing its alien vocal cords to mimic the audio files that had been burned into its mind during the 3-second data breach. "Error. Error 404. Buy one, get one free. Warning. Localized threat detected," the alien choked out. The voice was a horrifying, wet approximation of a synthesized human female voice, mangled by mandibles and alien biology. "Subscribe for more. The end is nigh. Hot singles in your area. Fatal exception. Fatal exception." Thomas took a step back from the glass, his face turning an unhealthy shade of green. He covered his mouth with the back of his hand. "Oh God, what did we do to it?" "We didn't do anything," David said quietly, his eyes fixed on the twitching creature. The antacids in his stomach weren't working. The heartburn was back, a slow burning clench behind his ribs. "It tried to download the internet, Thomas. It tried to digest the collective consciousness of a species that spends half its time figuring out how to build better bombs, and the other half arguing with strangers over imaginary numbers." Inside the room, the Vraxian suddenly convulsed against the restraints. The heavy steel table groaned under the immense physical power of the creature. "You have been locked out," the alien roared, the sound tearing its own throat, spraying a mist of gray fluid across the inside of Dr. Bennett's hazmat visor. "Please enter CAPTCHA to verify you are not a robot. I am not a robot. I am not. Error. Error." The creature collapsed back onto the table, its limbs trembling uncontrollably. A high-pitched whining sound, like a failing hard drive, emanated from deep within its chest cavity. Its neural architecture is trying to compartmentalize the corrupted data, but it doesn't have the biological framework for cognitive dissonance, Dr. Bennett explained. Her voice remarkably clinical as she wiped the gray fluid off her visor with a gloved hand. Humans can hold two contradictory thoughts in their head at the same time and not go insane. We call it politics. The Vraxians are built on absolute truth and logic. The paradoxes in our code are literally frying its synapses. David reached into his jacket pocket. His fingers brushed against a crumpled, half-empty pack of cigarettes. He wasn't supposed to smoke down here. He wasn't supposed to smoke at all, according to his doctor in Brussels. But the world had almost ended today, and he felt a bone-deep weariness that only nicotine could touch. He pulled out a slightly bent cigarette and struck a cheap gas station lighter. The small flame illuminated the deep lines around his eyes and the dark, exhausted hollows beneath them. He took a long, slow drag, letting the harsh smoke fill his lungs. "Sir, the oxygen sensors," Thomas whispered, looking around nervously. David ignored him, blowing a thin stream of gray smoke toward the ceiling. He looked back through the thick glass at the alien. The creature's mandibles were clicking weakly now, a rapid, frantic rhythm. "System failure. Format C drive. Delete, delete, delete," it whispered into the cold room, over and over, until the words dissolved into a wet, meaningless gurgle. David felt a strange, uncomfortable knot in his chest. It wasn't triumph. It wasn't the heroic satisfaction of a victorious ambassador who had just saved humanity from extinction. It was a profound, ugly sense of pity. They hadn't outsmarted the Vraxians. They hadn't fought them with superior tactics or unimaginable courage. They had simply been too dirty, too broken, and too fundamentally chaotic for a perfect organism to consume. Humanity was a poisoned apple, and the alien had taken a massive, unhesitating bite. "Dr. Bennett," David said, leaning toward the intercom mic, ash falling from his cigarette onto his cheap, ruined suit. "Can you put it out of its misery?" Bennett paused, looking down at the twitching, babbling monstrosity on her table. "I haven't isolated the exact neurotoxin required to stop its heart without triggering a violent adrenal reflex. It could take hours to synthesize." David took another drag, staring at the alien's unblinking, dead black eyes. "Then turn off the lights and leave the room, Doctor. Nobody should have to die listening to a pop-up ad." Bennett didn't argue. She carefully packed her diagnostic tablet, gave the restraints one last check, and moved toward the heavy airlock door. As the heavy steel door sealed shut behind the doctor, the main lights in isolation cell 4 flicked off, plunging the room into thick, heavy darkness, illuminated only by the faint, red glow of the emergency backup LEDs. In the dim crimson light, the Vraxian continued to twitch. Refreshing page. Connection lost." The wet voice echoed through the speaker, growing weaker, fading into the mechanical hum of the air scrubbers. David turned away from the glass. His knee throbbed, his back ached. The taste of copper and stale smoke was thick in his mouth. The world was saved, but the sheer, horrifying realization of how they had survived would haunt him for the rest of his life. "Come on, Thomas," David muttered, crushing the half-smoked cigarette under the heel of his shoe. "Let's go find out how much of the East Coast is underwater. We still have a lot of paperwork to do." The main command center of Cheyenne Mountain was a cavernous amphitheater of concrete, steel, and terrified people. It smelled heavily of burnt ozone, hot motherboards, and the sour, pervasive stench of nervous sweat. A massive array of digital screens curved along the far wall, casting a sickly, pale blue light over the faces of the technicians manning the sunken console pits. David leaned heavily against the railing of the upper observation deck. His right knee was locking up again, sending hot needles of pain up his thigh. He ignored it, his bloodshot eyes fixed on the center screen. It was displaying a live, high-altitude satellite feed of the eastern seaboard. "Tsunami warning sirens have been sounding for 20 minutes, General Miller said, stepping up beside David. The general had finally lit his cigar. The pungent, earthy smell of the tobacco cut through the stale air of the bunker, masking the scent of fear. Miller's voice was uncharacteristically quiet. "FEMA is mobilizing. National Guard is trying to force evacuations, but the highways, they're parking lots." David didn't say anything. He watched the screen. A dark, bruised line was drawing itself across the Atlantic Ocean, moving westward at terrifying speed. The crash of the Harbinger of Silence hadn't just displaced water. The dreadnought's dying anti-gravity drives had violently warped the localized gravitational field before finally shorting out. The resulting wave wasn't a normal tsunami. It was a localized tectonic event. "Impact in 4 minutes," a technician's voice called out from the pit below. Her voice cracked on the word minutes. Thomas stood on David's other side, clutching his tablet to his chest like a shield. The young man's lips were moving silently, maybe praying, maybe just running statistical models in his head. "We saved them," Thomas whispered, though it sounded more like a question. "We stopped the orbital bombardment. They were going to glass the cities." "Yes," David replied, his voice dry and hollow. "We stopped the fire. Now we get the flood." On the massive screen, the coastline of North America looked incredibly fragile. A thin, jagged line of green and gray against the vast, terrifying blue of the ocean. The satellite feed zoomed in, switching to a coastal traffic camera network in Boston. The screens fragmented into dozens of smaller squares. Each one showed the same thing: gridlock. Cars packed bumper to bumper on the interstates, red taillights glowing in the pre-dawn gloom. People were out of their vehicles, standing on the roofs of sedans and minivans, looking east toward a horizon that was no longer flat. The horizon was a wall of black water. "God Almighty," Miller breathed, taking the cigar out of his mouth. David felt his stomach heave, the acid churning against the lining of his throat. He swallowed hard, forcing it down. He couldn't look away. He forced himself to watch. This was the price of his clever little victory. This was the receipt for human survival. The ocean didn't just hit the coast, it erased it. On the screens, the water crested the seawalls without slowing down. It was a massive, churning avalanche of gray foam, pulverized concrete, and deep-sea mud. It swallowed the highways in an instant. The red taillights simply vanished beneath the frothing dark. Buildings made of steel and glass held for a fraction of a second before the sheer, unimaginable kinetic force of the water shattered them into clouds of debris. The audio feeds from the traffic cameras cut to static, one by one. Pop, pop, pop. A rhythmic, mechanical death knell as the infrastructure of the East Coast was systematically drowned. Within 90 seconds, the lower half of Manhattan was gone. Boston was a lake. The water pushed miles inland, dragging ships, cars, and the shattered remnants of human lives with it. The command center was dead silent. The only sounds were the hum of the servers and the soft, ragged breathing of the people in the room. Nobody cheered. The aliens were dead. The invasion was stopped, and nobody felt like a winner. "Casualty projections?" Miller finally asked, his voice rough, like he was speaking through a throat full of gravel. A technician in the pit hesitated, her fingers hovering over a glowing keyboard. "Initial estimates, considering the gridlock and the height of the displacement wave. We're looking at 4 to 6 million. Minimum, sir." Thomas made a small, choked sound and turned away from the railing, covering his face with his hands. David closed his eyes. The blue light from the screens still bled through his eyelids, staining his vision. 4 million people. He had sat in a room, looked an alien warlord in the eyes, and gambled with the lives of billions. He had won the gamble. And the house had still taken 4 million souls as a tax. "Pull the rescue choppers from the Midwest," Miller ordered, his tone shifting back to the clipped, pragmatic bark of a commander. Reroute all military medical supplies to the Appalachian staging grounds. The water will recede, and when it does, it's going to leave a graveyard. I want boots in the mud the second the tide pulls back." "Yes, General," the pit responded in a synchronized murmur. David slowly opened his eyes and pushed himself away from the railing. His joints popped. He felt incredibly old. He felt like dust. "Where are you going, Cole?" Miller asked, not looking away from the screens. "Sub-level 7, David said, straightening his cheap jacket. The recovery teams pulled another pod out of the Atlantic before the wave hit. A command tier pod. Miller frowned, finally turning to look at him. "We don't need to negotiate anymore, David. Their dreadnought is at the bottom of the ocean. Their hive mind is fractured." "I'm not going to negotiate," David said, his voice flat, devoid of any emotion he was desperately trying to suppress. "I'm going to ask it how it feels." Sub-level 7 was a repurposed munitions bunker, far less clinical than the biological containment labs. It was brutalist and raw. Exposed concrete walls, heavy iron blast doors, and a persistent, damp chill that smelled like wet limestone and old rust. They had chained the Vraxian to a heavy steel structural pillar in the center of the room. This one was different from the drone in the biolab. It was wearing the shredded remains of a command mantle, a bioluminescent armor that was now flickering weakly, bleeding a thick, violet sludge onto the concrete floor. The creature was massive, easily 8 feet tall, but it was slumped forward, its 4 arms hanging limply in the heavy titanium restraints. David stood on the other side of a reinforced steel mesh barrier, smoking his second cigarette of the hour. The harsh overhead work lights cast deep, jagged shadows across the alien's carapace. Unlike the babbling drone, this Vraxian was silent. "It hasn't made a sound since they hauled it in," Thomas said, standing a few feet behind David. The kid had washed his face, but his eyes were still red and puffy from the command center. He held a translation module in his shaking hands. "Life signs are erratic. Heart rate is spiking and crashing every few minutes. Dr. Bennett thinks it's having continuous micro-panic attacks." "Hook up the audio feed," David muttered, taking a drag and letting the smoke drift lazily through the steel mesh. Thomas fiddled with the tablet. A sharp burst of static crackled from the wall-mounted speakers, followed by the wet, rhythmic clicking sound of the alien breathing. David stepped closer to the mesh. The smell of ammonia and violet blood was overpowering, making his eyes water. "Can you understand me?" David asked. His voice was calm, conversational, like a man asking for directions on a rainy street. The massive alien flinched. The movement was sudden and violent, a full-body shudder that rattled the heavy titanium chains against the pillar. Its 4 black eyes slowly raised, locking on to David. The depth of the void in those eyes had changed. Before, in the negotiation room with Kalen, the blackness had been cold, calculating, and infinite. Now, the blackness looked small. It looked terrified. A wet, guttural series of clicks and hisses emanated from the creature's mandibles. The cheap translator earpiece in David's ear buzzed, processing the guttural sounds into English. "It is quiet," the translated voice whispered. The digital rendering couldn't convey emotion, but the pacing of the words, slow, halting, desperate, carried the weight of absolute horror. "Your localized network is gone," David said, leaning against the mesh. He didn't feel triumphant. He just felt tired. "Your dreadnought crashed. The connection to your ascendancy is severed. You are disconnected. The alien squeezed its 4 eyes shut. A low, keening whine vibrated in its chest cavity, vibrating through the concrete floor. There is no we, the Vraxian choked out. There is only here, inside this shell. The silence is... it is crushing. It is heavy. How do you bear the weight of it? David took another slow drag of his cigarette. He looked at the creature. He saw a being that had existed for centuries as a single thread in a vast, beautiful, perfect tapestry. Every thought shared. Every fear diluted by a billion other minds. Every decision mathematically perfect and collectively agreed upon. Now, the thread had been ripped out. It was lying on a cold concrete floor, utterly alone. You're experiencing individuality, David said, his voice devoid of pity, but not cruel, just factual. You are locked inside your own skull. It's just you in there now. The Vraxian strained against the chains, not trying to break them, but trying to feel the physical resistance. Trying to anchor itself to reality. The data you injected into the hive, the alien clicked, its mandibles clicking frantically. The noise, the contradictions. We saw a billion minds moving in a billion different directions. We saw hate algorithms looping into empathy subroutines. We saw logic consuming itself. It was a disease. It wasn't a disease, David corrected mildly. It was just us. We didn't build our network to be a weapon. We built it to be a mirror. You just couldn't handle the reflection. The alien slumped against the pillar again, a fresh wave of violet fluid weeping from the joints in its armor. I am alone, the alien said, the translator struggling to parse the sheer volume of the creature's existential dread. I have a thought, and no one answers. I feel a terror, and no one shares it. The boundaries of my flesh are the boundaries of my universe. I am a single point of data in an endless void. It is a sickness, the sickness of I. Thomas, standing behind David, let out a shaky breath. Sir, it's going insane. No, David said softly, never taking his eyes off the alien. It's becoming human. David dropped his cigarette onto the concrete floor and crushed it under his heel. He walked over to the heavy blast door, pulling the access lever. How do you survive it? The alien suddenly screamed, a horrifying wet roar that clipped the audio sensors and made Thomas cover his ears. The Vraxian was thrashing now, the chains groaning under the immense strain. How do you endure the silence of your own minds? How do you live in this chaotic, isolated hell without tearing your own flesh apart? David stopped in the open doorway. He looked back at the creature. He thought about the 4 million people currently buried under the Atlantic Ocean. He thought about his ex-wife in Brussels, the daughter he hadn't spoken to in 3 years, the burning ache in his chest, and the sheer, unending noise of a world that was constantly on the brink of setting itself on fire. He didn't have a grand philosophical answer. He didn't have an inspirational quote. We just wake up the next day, David said quietly, and we make coffee. He walked out of the room, letting the heavy steel door slam shut behind him, leaving the alien alone in the dark to scream at a silence that would never answer back. 2 weeks later, the smell of the end of the world was no longer ozone and wet copper. It was diesel exhaust, rotting kelp, and the suffocating heavy stench of stagnant mud. The eastern seaboard hadn't just been flooded, it had been terraformed. David stood on what used to be a coastal highway just outside of Richmond, Virginia. Now, it was a fractured ribbon of asphalt plunging into a vast, gray swamp. The water had receded, leaving behind a thick layer of toxic, debris-choked sludge that coated everything like a scab. He was wearing heavy rubber boots that were 2 sizes too large, a stained canvas jacket over a flannel shirt, and a pair of thick work gloves. The cheap charcoal suit was gone, thrown in a biohazard incinerator back in Colorado. He felt the cold dampness seeping through the soles of his boots, sending a dull ache up into his bad knee. Around him, the relief camp was a symphony of miserable noise. The roar of diesel generators, the rhythmic thud of Chinook helicopters dropping pallets of bottled water, and the low, constant murmur of 50,000 displaced survivors huddled in FEMA tents. Thomas trudged up the incline toward him, his boots sucking loudly at the mud. The kid looked different. The pristine Oxford veneer had cracked. He hadn't shaved in 10 days. His eyes were bloodshot, and there was a streak of dried motor oil across his forehead. He looked older, heavier. He looked like he actually lived on Earth now. "The engineers got the water purification pumps running in Sector 4, Thomas reported, his breath pluming in the cold morning air. He handed David a dented thermos. "And I found coffee, real coffee, not the instant garbage from the bunker." David took the thermos with stiff fingers. He unscrewed the cap and took a sip. It was black, sludgy, and tasted slightly of burnt plastic. It was the best thing he had tasted in a month. "Good work," David rasped, handing the thermos back. They stood in silence for a moment, looking out over the devastation. Half a mile out, the rusted husk of a container ship was sitting perfectly upright in the middle of a destroyed suburban neighborhood, surrounded by snapped pine trees and the shattered teeth of residential foundations. "NORAD caught a transmission," Thomas said quietly, staring at the ship. "An hour ago." David didn't turn his head. "From the Ascendancy? From a relay station out past Jupiter. It wasn't a synaptic bridge. It was analog, radio waves, old school." Thomas pulled a folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket, the edges stained with mud. "They broadcasted it on a loop for 10 minutes, and then the relay self-destructed. We translated it." David finally looked at him. "Read it." Thomas unfolded the paper. His hands were shaking, just a little. "Sector localized, quarantine absolute, do not interface, do not observe. The species is infected with chaos. The planet is a mimetic hazard. To touch their minds is to invite the sickness of isolation. They are broken, yet they persist. Burn the bridges, leave them to the dark." Thomas lowered the paper. "They're not coming back, David. They're terrified of us. They locked the door from the outside." David looked back out at the ruined landscape. A cold wind whipped off the Atlantic, carrying the smell of salt and decay. They were the apex predators of the galaxy, a perfect, unified organism that conquered stars with mathematical precision. And humanity had repelled them not with lasers, not with shields, but by simply being too toxic, too traumatized, and too mentally fragmented to be digested. We were the rat poison of the cosmos. "What happened to the pods?" David asked, his voice rough. "The ones we pulled out of the ocean?" "They're dying," Thomas said, his tone flat. "Dr. Bennett says it's widespread neural cascade failure. Without the hive mind, their brains can't regulate their own biology. They stop eating. They stop moving. They just curl up and shut down. They can't survive the silence." David thought about the command tier alien chained to the pillar in Cheyenne Mountain, screaming at the terror of its own individuality. It had been a god of 1,000 star systems, brought low by the simple, crushing weight of being alone. They built a perfect society, David murmured, watching a medical chopper bank low over the horizon, its red cross vivid against the gray sky. No arguments, no misunderstandings, no loneliness. But they forgot that perfection makes you fragile. You build a greenhouse, you raise beautiful, flawless orchids. But the second a winter storm shatters the glass, the orchids die. He turned and began to walk down the muddy embankment, his knee popping with every heavy step. "We're not orchids, Thomas," David said over his shoulder. "We're weeds. We grow in the dirt. We choke each other out. We survive on scraps, and we are ugly. But you can't kill a weed by throwing it in the mud." By nightfall, the temperature plummeted, turning the mud into a treacherous frozen landscape of jagged ruts and slick ice. David sat on an overturned plastic crate near the edge of the camp, holding his bare hands out over a rusted steel barrel filled with burning scrap wood. The fire snapped and popped, throwing harsh orange light across his exhausted face. The stars were out. For the first time in 3 weeks, the sky was completely clear. No alien dreadnoughts blocking the moon. No bruised atmospheric disturbances. Just the cold, indifferent, infinite black of space. General Miller emerged from the gloom, his heavy boots crunching on the frozen mud. He wasn't wearing his dress uniform. He wore a heavy tactical fleece and an old beanie pulled down over his ears. He looked like an old man who had spent too many years carrying things that were too heavy. Miller stopped by the fire, holding his hands out to the flames. He didn't have a cigar. He had run out a week ago. "Casualty count from the coastal sweep was updated," Miller said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "We're at 4.2 million confirmed. Another million missing." "Yeah," David breathed. He stared into the fire. "I know." "They're calling you a hero in Geneva, Cole," Miller said, looking at him sideways. "The UN wants to pin a medal on you, the man who outsmarted the Ascendancy." David let out a harsh, barking laugh that quickly dissolved into a wet, painful cough. "Outsmarted them, that's a good one." He rubbed his face, feeling the thick, greasy stubble on his cheeks. "I didn't outsmart them, General. I just knew what we were. I knew that our greatest defense wasn't our military or our technology. It was our sheer, relentless dysfunction." David looked up at the stars. They looked colder than he remembered. They looked at us and saw a resource. They didn't realize they were trying to drink from a poisoned well. Miller was quiet for a long time. The wood in the barrel shifted, sending a shower of bright orange sparks up into the dark sky. "My wife died in Boston," Miller said softly. David froze. He slowly turned his head to look at the general. Miller's face was completely impassive, illuminated by the firelight. He wasn't crying. He was just stating a fact, a brutal, immovable piece of reality. "She was visiting her sister," Miller continued, his eyes fixed on the flames. "When the wave hit, I was in the bunker, watching it on a satellite feed. I watched the water hit her neighborhood. I knew she was gone before her phone even went to voicemail." David felt a cold knot form in his stomach, heavier than the mud, heavier than the exhaustion. "General, I'm so—" "Don't," Miller interrupted, his voice sharp, but not angry. "Don't apologize, David. It was a numbers game. You made the call, the right call. If they had assimilated the grid, if they had taken the defense networks, it wouldn't be 4 million dead. It would be 8 billion enslaved. You saved the species. Miller looked away from the fire, meeting David's eyes. But I want you to know, Miller said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. I have to wake up every morning in an empty house. I have to look in the mirror, and I have to choose every single day not to put a bullet in my own head. That is the cost of living with this. David stared at the general, recognizing the profound, bottomless grief hidden behind the military stoicism. The Vraxians couldn't handle 3 seconds of our pain, Miller said, turning back to the fire. They couldn't process the grief, the anger, the sheer contradictory noise of being human. They died from it, but we don't die from it, do we, Cole? We just pack it down, we carry it. We build our cities back on top of our own graves. David nodded slowly. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a fresh pack of cigarettes he'd scrounged from a supply truck. He offered one to Miller. The general looked at it for a second, then took it. David took one for himself, lighting them both with a piece of burning kindling from the barrel. They stood there, 2 tired old men at the end of the world, smoking in the freezing dark. We are deeply, fundamentally broken, David said, exhaling a long plume of gray smoke into the night air. We hurt each other. We destroy our own planet. We build weapons we can't control, and we create digital nightmares just to see if we can. The universe looked at us, tasted us, and violently spat us out. David looked up at the stars one last time. The galaxy had locked its doors. Humanity was isolated, quarantined, left to our own chaotic devices. We were the monsters in the dark. But we're still here, David whispered, feeling the ache in his knee, the burn of the smoke in his lungs, and the heavy, terrifying, beautiful weight of being alive. He took another drag. God help anyone who tries to take this mud away from us. If this story made you feel the raw, chaotic power of human resilience, hit that like button to feed the algorithm. Subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss another HFY Sci-Fi original. Do you think humanity's greatest strength is our ability to endure our own mess? Or are we truly the monsters in the dark? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. Share this video with someone who needs a reminder that we are tough weeds, not fragile orchids. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.